Hey everyone, welcome to Blood, Guts, and Social Commentary. Today's wisest thing I kind of touched on in the vomit gore episode, but I wanted to do a full episode just getting into this film in particular. If you didn't look at the title of this video, I'm going to be talking about Drag Me to Hell and how it relates to eating disorders. So if you don't want spoilers for Drag Me to Hell or cannot handle a discussion about eating disorders, I would suggest you click off now. Sam Raimi's 2009 film revolves around a lone officer named Christine who evicted an old woman from her home. As penance for Christine kicking her out, she puts a curse on her. The rest of the film is spent with Christine trying to fend off the Lamia that is after her and save her soul from eternal damnation. We see hints at the very beginning of this movie that Christine has some kind of issue with food. While she's going to work, she stares at a bakery window in an almost lustful way. You can tell the bakery is open, she could easily walk in and get something. It's clear that she's not running late for work because she's kind of lollygagging. But she doesn't walk in, she doesn't purchase anything, she just stares at this window full of baked goods with this, it's like, I want it, I wish I could have it, but I can't have it. And for the record, if you haven't seen this film, Christine is by no stretch of the imagination heavy and makes no reference to ever being on a diet. When Christine gets into work, she makes her ambitions fairly clear to her boss that she is very interested in an assistant manager position. She's going up against another guy named Stu who's much newer to the branch than she is, but the boss goes on and on about how he's aggressive and he worries Christine is not, which seems to, in his mind, be her only major shortcoming because she does her work perfectly. And that's pretty standard with people that do have eating disorders. They are perfectionists, they do things well, but they don't necessarily feel like they have control or can go after something they want like an aggressive or an assertive person could. Whether those failings are valid or not varies very much on the person themselves. Not too long after this conversation, she heads off to lunch with her boyfriend. The scene begins later in, so she could have eaten earlier, but all we see is her drinking. We don't see her actually ingest any food. When she leaves their boyfriend's office after he's just gotten a big promotion, he's on the phone with his mother and she overhears how his mother does not think Christine is good enough for him. That's understandably hurtful because her and her boyfriend have been together almost a year. Not only has she not met his parents yet, but the fact that his mother already disapproves of her sight unseen simply because she's from a farm and compares her to other girlfriends her boyfriend's had in the past. That's gotta hurt no matter who you are. So she's internalizing that feeling and feeling worthless because she's feeling like she's not adequate at work, and now she's not adequate for her boyfriend. When she gets back to work, she hands Stu and her boss the sandwiches they asked for. He claims Christine messed up, and he said he did not want mayo. She got it with mayo. She says, no, you never said that, which he didn't. He did not say no mayo. So some of this could be her perception of feeling bad about herself, but there are also, clearly when it comes to Stu, some mind games going on to make her feel even worse. He's clearly targeting her. He's clearly trying to make her look bad to pass her by for a promotion at work. Here's when we start to get to the meat of the story. An older gypsy woman comes in and asks for an extension on her loan before her house is repossessed because she's had some health issues that's caused her to lose her eye, and she keeps spitting things up into a napkin. She goes, talks to her boss, and he says, well, it's a tough decision, it's your call. Clearly as a test to see if she can stand up to this, because most people do not want to kick a little old lady out of her home, especially when it's the only home she's ever had. Christine makes the call and says, we've already granted you 2 extensions. We can't do it again. I'm sorry, you're out unless you can get us the money. This obviously makes her upset, even though she probably wasn't as sick as she was claiming to be, because the second Christine walked away, she took her dentures out and started eating candy and just seemed perfectly fine. She stopped coughing, she stopped spitting, everything. This results in a massive altercation. Before the old woman is dragged out of the building, she attempts one more time to attack Christine. This obviously rattles Christine because you can tell she wants to be well liked by people. You can tell she is a people pleaser as well as a perfectionist, which again plays very much into the psychological makeup that many have that end up with eating disorders. But Christine's boss not only commends her on the treatment of the loan, he commends her on the McPherson file, which is possibly one of the biggest accounts that branch would ever cover. He wants her to take it home, work on it tonight, so he can present it to the board tomorrow, which is a huge deal. So of course stressed from the altercation she just went through, but very driven and wanting this job and wanting to please her boss, she takes it home. When she goes into the parking garage, though, she's attacked by the old woman again. This is where we start to see kind of the oral fixation this movie has. During the course of the fight, the old woman's teeth fall out, but Christine punches them back in by basically punching her hand into her mouth. Christine stabs her in the mouth with a ruler, which the old woman spits back out at her. This altercation ends with Christine's window getting smashed out of her car and the old woman kind of dragging her around the parking deck, eventually ripping a button off of her coat and cursing it, then handing it back to Christine, which is a big point of all the curses in this film, is any cursed object needs to be given as a gift to whoever you want to curse. Christine passes out after said curse is given. She comes to with a fly on her eyelid, and flies will also play in heavily. When her and her boyfriend are out later that night, it's clear she had a small break from the norm because she wanted to go get her fortune read. It was $60 and her boyfriend was a little pissed off about it because you can tell that this is not a behavior that she normally indulges in, and he is very analytically minded. He quotes Freud at the psychic quotes Jung back to him. The fortune teller confirms what's already in Christine's mind and that she is quote-unquote cursed. When she goes home and tries to process the events of the day as well as the events of the psychic reading, she finds an old picture of herself where she is much heavier. She crumples it up as if she's destroying that old body and those old memories. Then a weird breeze kind of blows through the house and they have pots and pans kind of hanging from a rack above. Any kind of heavy metal pot or pan should not be waving in the breeze. That's a little weird. Her boyfriend believes that somebody broke into the house because he was away during this event. Christine swears up and down there was no one in the house. And when these kind of paranormal events keep happening throughout the film, it's typically going to revolve around the kitchen. A doctor comes and believes all Christine's weird behavior is due to PTSD from the events of that day, just really hammering in on her. While she's sleeping, a fly crawls in and out of her mouth, and eventually she swallows it, so she wakes up coughing. Then she realizes the old woman's on top of her and vomits onto her face a mixture of bugs, dirt, looks like there might be a little bit of blood in there. Not only is this on her face, but obviously some of it gets into her mouth, on her chest. She wakes up realizing it was a dream within a dream, though. The next day at work, she touches her stomach as most people would do if they're kind of hungry and it's rumbling. But you hear a fly, which normally is symbolic of something being empty and hollow, that you're hearing this kind of fly buzzing around in it, because flies tend not to make that much noise. So for metaphor's sake, the fly's sounds are reverberating off her stomach walls because her stomach's empty. Stu asks to be taught loan procedures. She wants to put him off, but he kind of guilts her into doing so. When they start into it, Stu starts tapping his fingers on her desk, which is the same thing the old woman did, so she keeps kind of intermixing the two, eventually leading to an outburst of her screaming, "Get your filthy pig knuckle off my desk." Pig is what most people use when they're likening somebody that's heavier set to a barnyard animal, and the outburst could be just from mood swings from not having eaten. When she flies up to yell at Stu, though, her nose starts bleeding. Eventually this turns into her throat gushing blood that sprays all over her boss. Now, it's pretty clear from the references to vomit and the things going down throat that they're probably hinting that she's more bulimic than anorexic. And if you've ever thrown up a lot, intentionally or unintentionally, just because you're sick, eventually you get to a point where you just don't have enough food on your stomach, that it's not uncommon to start throwing up bile. If your throat's raw and sore enough, sometimes blood if you've ruptured something or just your throat's been cut open. So the fact that Christine has blood pouring out of her mouth is a pretty heavy-handed indication that there's something very, very wrong with her on a physiological level. After this, she's decided she has enough and tries to go to the old woman's home. Her granddaughter answers and even says to her, "You used to be a real fat girl, didn't you?" When she confirms this, she goes, "Well, I can tell." And that's a very old movie and TV trope of asking somebody if they used to be fat because the way they're acting tells people that they at one point were fat or weren't always attractive. But again, it's pointing to Christine's issues with her weight, and especially her weight in the past. Eventually, Christine is able to convince the granddaughter to let her in, where she finds out the old woman has passed. She finds this out by stumbling back into the casket, knocking the body over onto herself. This causes the old woman to vomit about greenish fluid on her face, mostly into her mouth. Nobody immediately assists her because most people would not assume if you go to a funeral, the corpse is going to get knocked over on a stranger. So it was a bit of shock and a bit of reaction. While the fluid that comes out of the old woman's mouth is most likely some kind of embalming fluid, the fact that it has a greenish yellowish tinge could also indicate bile or stomach fluid, which is exactly the same reason she threw up blood. She runs back to the psychic, and that's when they pinpoint it's a Lamia that's following her around. Essentially, it's a dark spirit that's going to harass her until she eventually gets dragged down to hell when the earth opens up and swallows her. He spitballs a couple suggestions, but the one that's most likely to work is an animal sacrifice. Christine immediately says that she's a vegetarian. Now, this might be out of fashion, but before vegetarianism was as prevalent as it is today, a lot of people would claim to be vegetarian or vegan as an excuse for highly restricted eating. So if they go somewhere, they go like, oh, it has an animal product in it, I can't eat it. And it was a polite way to excuse themselves from dinner. With the rise of food allergies and more people going vegetarian and vegan, a lot more people are willing to accommodate cooking or would already know about somebody's dietary restrictions before they would have a meal at their house, so this might not be as commonplace anymore, but it used to be pretty prevalent. She is harassed by the Lamia once again, this time throwing her around her bedroom and destroying a lot of things. She gives up and sacrifices a small kitten that they've had. She buries it in the backyard, and when her boyfriend comes home, he calls her out on the blood on her sleeve. She says it's tomato juice. She was cutting up a tomato for lunch. At no point has Christine really been shown having a meal between this. Obviously, she's lying because she doesn't want to cop to killing the kitten because most people would not want to do that. But at the same time, she's also lying about food and the fact that she hasn't had any. This plays an even heavier significance when you realize she's going that night to meet her boyfriend's parents for the first time at a meal. She brings a harvest cake, explains how the yolks from duck eggs at that time of year are most hearty, so that's how you get a really dense cake. You can tell the mother's a little disgusted by her talking about things like that. At the dinner table, Christine's pressed for talking about her career, which she's more than open about. She points out that the McPherson account she brought in from reading the Wall Street Journal and would be the biggest account that branch has ever seen. This is 100% her thing. So obvious, again, driven at work. When the mother quips that her mother must be proud, she points out that her dad died when she was young, and her mother kind of keeps to herself. When pressed as to why, she confesses that her mother's an alcoholic. Again, as discussed on the Vomit Core episode, having a mother who's dealing with some demons and not really knowing how to cope with them, it sounds like she might have picked up the alcoholism when Christine was still at home, and Christine may have had to become responsible for her mother. This could have again been her trying to react and cope and gain some kind of control back by being the child put in the parent situation, by being forced to be a parent when she really should have been a child. Her boyfriend's mother is actually impressed by this response and finds Christine being honest and forthcoming kind of refreshing. They start to warm up to her, and then her cake is served. Christine starts to see an eyeball popping out of hers. Now, if you've gone a long time without eating or under heavy stress, hallucinations aren't totally uncommon. In addition to that, most people with eating disorders, while they're obsessed with food and constantly think about food, they have to convince themselves in some way, shape, or form it's repugnant to convince themselves not to eat the food. So while most people would interpret, I shouldn't have that cake because it's a lot of calories and I don't want to gain the weight and become unhealthy, Christine's looking at it and going, if I eat that cake, it's got so many calories, I'll immediately become fat. Or I will become fat at some point. I can't eat this because eating and backsliding is something I just can't deal with. Or she's thinking about how much time between eating the cake and getting to a bathroom she has and trying to decipher if she can throw up there without anybody noticing. When she tries to take a bite of it, she chokes on it, coughs, and a fly comes up as well. She starts hearing a banging on the door and screams at it, throws a wine glass at it. The parents are clearly distraught. They don't like their son bringing a girl to the house that just freaked out and screamed at a closed door and threw a wine glass at it. She again runs back to the psychic. He says he's got to get somebody more powerful than him, and it's going to cost her 10 grand. She runs around the house and gathers up every single sellable thing she can. While this happens, the apparition of the old woman comes back and punches her literally in the throat and goes about elbow deep into her mouth. She's able to cut an anvil hanging from the ceiling on top of her, liquefying her and making her flat. Obvious symbolism's kind of obvious there. She goes to sell her stuff, but she can only get $3,800. Her boyfriend comes home to her eating ice cream. He points out that he thought she was lactose intolerant. She said, "Screw it, I don't care, I'm eating ice cream." She shows no ill effects from that ice cream ever in the rest of the movie. So odds are she's not lactose intolerant. Her boyfriend ends up paying the rest of the money to the psychic to allow this ritual to happen. Unfortunately, it doesn't go well, and Christine ends up at a diner. The waitress yells at her and says, "Are you going to sit here drinking coffee all night?" When she says, "Yeah, who cares, I'm paying you." The waitress goes on a spiel about tips and how coffee drinkers don't tip. Again, it's not uncommon for somebody with an eating disorder to live almost completely off coffee and water, because the caffeine in a coffee is enough to give them energy without it being a high caloric food. While she's doing this, she's kind of looking around and seeing if there's somebody she can gift the button to pass on the curse so she doesn't die. Eventually, she calls Stu and threatens to rat him out because the McPherson vial disappeared off her desk and went over to First National. Clearly, she knows Stu did it. She calls him, makes him come to the diner. When he comes to the diner, she's again sitting there eating sundaes. She's eating ice cream again. Again, not having ill effect. Probably not lactose intolerant. And kind of the ending of I'm going to talk about, but not necessarily the ending of the film, she ends up backing off and not giving the curse to Stu. Her and the psychic talk once again and realize that she actually may be able to gift the button back to the person that gave her the curse. Even though the old woman's dead, you are allowed to give certain things to the deceased for their time in the afterlife. When she's driving there, a scarf kind of flutters by, which has been happening a lot through the film, except for this time, it goes down her throat and she has to rip it back up. Not to mention the fact that to get to the body, Christine has to dig up a grave. There's a big rainstorm, water's rushing in, dirt's rushing in. She ends up being knocked out by a tombstone. But again, it's pretty obvious heavy-handed symbolism. Most people that have an eating disorder and seriously have an eating disorder are going to end up having a lot of physical complications from it. A lot of times this leads to death, either from directly not eating, directly making yourself throw up, or just another complication that arose from you not eating or constantly throwing up. And should read as still playing into this. She has a problem. She has something that she has to fix, but she's so focused on something else in her life that she's trying to fix to distract from the real problem. Not to mention that there's an entity following her around that's kind of a dark figure. While she calls it the Lamia, it's not uncommon for people suffering from an eating disorder to kind of personify their disorder as a human being, as either another personality or kind of a demon that follows them around. Sometimes these are even kind of used as a term of endearment in about the most endearing way you can be with something like this. So in this case, the Lamia could very much be Christine's issues with herself manifesting in another way. That'll conclude today's episode. If you like what you're hearing, please hit like, comment, subscribe. If you don't like what you're hearing, please leave me a comment and let me know. Thank you.